At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, a single American officer crouched inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. Sweat ran down his spine. Mud clung to his uniform. His eyes stayed pressed to a scope that every man in his battalion had laughed at for 6 straight weeks. Second Lieutenant John George was 27 years old, an Illinois state shooting champion, 0 confirmed kills, and holding what his commanding officer had openly called a toy through the glass of his Winchester Model 70, fitted with a civilian Lyman Alaskan. George watched a banyan tree 240 yards away. The rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds, privately purchased, shipped through military mail like a hunting accessory. The standard issue M1 Garands around him fired faster, held more rounds, and carried the full weight of Army doctrine behind them, but doctrine wasn't stopping the snipers. In the past 72 hours, 14 American soldiers were dead, picked off one by one from treetops no one could see into. Canteens filled, patrols halted, necks exposed for a fraction of a second. The Japanese were everywhere and nowhere, turning the jungle into a killing ground. George's rifle had arrived late. It had arrived mocked. Men called it his mail-order sweetheart. The armorer back in Tennessee had asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. His captain had ordered him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. Now the battalion commander had run out of patience and men. He had given George until morning to prove one thing, that a rifle meant for civilian competition could hunt professional killers trained for jungle war. At 9:17, a branch moved, no wind. George stopped breathing, and history leaned forward. Second Lieutenant John George had not come to war planning to prove anyone wrong. He had come with the rifle he trusted because long before the Army needed him, accuracy had already defined his life. George grew up shooting in Illinois. By his early 20s, he was already known in competitive circles. In 1939, at just 23 years old, he became the youngest man ever to win the Illinois State Rifle Championship at 1,000 yards. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights were not theory to him. They were routine. Precision was not confidence, it was repetition. That was why, 2 years before America entered the war, George spent 2 full years of National Guard pay on a rifle he believed in, a Winchester Model 70, topped with a Lyman Alaskan. It was not issued. It was not approved. It was civilian equipment, bought through mail order, shipped in a wooden crate marked fragile. When George unpacked it at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer laughed. The rifle was heavy, the scope added weight. 5 rounds only, slow, obsolete. Every other man in the battalion carried the semi-automatic M1 Garand, 8 rounds, faster follow-up shots, modern war doctrine embodied in steel and walnut. George explained the rifle was not for Europeans, it was for the Japanese. The battalion shipped out before the rifle ever arrived. While other officers cleaned their Garands on the transport, George crossed the Pacific knowing his weapons sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He filed the paperwork anyway, requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December of 1942, a supply sergeant on Guadalcanal handed him a battered wooden crate. Inside was the rifle everyone would mock. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the Marines after months of brutal fighting. Henderson Field was held, but the island was not secure. Japanese forces still controlled the jungle west of the Matanikau River, especially the coconut groves. Near Point Cruz, the Marines had learned the hard way that bunkers could be destroyed, but snipers could not be bombed out of trees. Mount Austin had fallen after 16 days of combat. 34 Americans killed, 279 wounded, and through all of it, George had not fired a single round in anger. Then the snipers started working. They operated without bunkers, without fixed positions, banyan trees towering 90 feet high, trunks thick enough to hide men all day, scoped Arisaka rifles, pairs working together, 1 shooter, 1 observer. They waited, watched, and punished routine. On January 19th, a corporal was shot while filling canteens. On the 20th, 2 men died on patrol. On the 21st, 3 more. 1 was killed from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander summoned George that night. Not because he believed in the rifle, because he was running out of options. George explained his credentials calmly. Competitions, distances, groups, ballistics. The commander listened in silence, then gave him a single condition. At dawn, George would take that rifle forward alone. If it worked, the sniper problem ended. If it didn't, the rifle went back in the tent. George spent the night cleaning Cosmoline from the action, checking mounts, loading 5 rounds of 30 to 06 hunting ammunition. He slept little. At dawn, he moved into the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker overlooking the groves west of Point Cruz. By 9:17 he was watching the trees, and the jungle was watching back. The jungle never went quiet. Birds shrieked. Insects buzzed. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery thumped like a distant heartbeat. Inside the broken Japanese bunker, John George filtered it all out and watched for one thing only: movement. The Lyman Alaskan gave him just 2.5 power magnification. Not much, enough. George moved the glass slowly across the banyan tree line west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal, left to right, top to bottom. 90-foot trees, branches thick enough to hold a man, shadows deep enough to swallow one. At 9:17, a branch shifted. There was no wind. George froze the scope on the spot. 87 feet up, a fork where 3 limbs met. He waited. Seconds stretched. The branch moved again, just slightly. Not enough to be foliage. Too deliberate. A man. Dark clothing. Rifle angled east toward the supply trail. A Japanese sniper. Settled in to kill anyone who exposed himself for a second too long. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind. He let his breathing slow. The trigger on the Winchester Model 70 broke like glass. The shot cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the sniper jerked and vanished. His body tore through branches and hit the ground with a sound George felt more than heard. He worked the bolt automatically. Empty casing out. New round in. Scope back on the tree. Nothing moved. Japanese snipers did not work alone. George shifted to the surrounding banyans. 60 yards north, lower in the canopy, he caught movement again. This one was descending the trunk, retreating. The second man had heard the shot and knew the position was compromised. George led the movement and fired. The second sniper fell backward, rifle clattering down through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills, less than 30 minutes since first contact. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. This was not Camp Perry, but the fundamentals were the same. At 11:21, a rifle round slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. Dirt sprayed his face. He rolled left, pressed into the bunker wall, and waited. The shot had come from the southwest. Different angle. Different team. 3 minutes passed. George eased back to the firing slit and searched T. He southwest sector. He found the shooter at 11:38. 73 feet up in a cluster of 5 banyans. The sniper had shifted branches but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George fired. The third body dropped without a sound. By noon, 5 Japanese snipers lay dead in the groves. Word spread fast. Men who had laughed at the rifle now whispered about it. George ignored them. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The enemy adapted. After the 5th kill, the trees went still. No movement, no shots. George spent hours glassing branches and shadows, seeing nothing. At 1,600 hours, he returned to headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The jokes were gone. The order was simple: be back at dawn. January 23rd opened with heavy rain. Visibility collapsed. The jungle turned to mud. George stayed in position, unmoving, letting the weather work for him. When the rain stopped at 8:15, the snipers were already in the trees. At 9:12, he found one at 290 yards. Longer range. Smarter placement. George compensated and fired. The 6th sniper fell. At 9:57, mortars began walking toward his bunker. First salvo short. Second closer, George ran. The bunker vanished in explosions seconds after he left it. He relocated, settled in again, and resumed the hunt. At 14:23, he killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, the 8th. 94 feet up, silhouetted when the sun shifted. 8 dead in 2 days. That night, George cleaned his rifle and counted the numbers. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 3 were left. And now they knew exactly who was hunting them. The night of January 23rd passed without sleep. John George lay in his tent on Guadalcanal, the Winchester Model 70 across his chest, rain tapping softly on canvas. 8 snipers were dead. 3 remained, and the ones still alive were no longer careless. They were professionals. Before dawn on January 24th, rain returned, heavier than before. George used it to move, not to the bunker, not to the fallen tree, somewhere unexpected. A cluster of rocks 70 yards south, once used by Marines as a machine gun nest. Elevated ground, overlapping sight lines, limited approach routes. He settled in and waited. When the rain thinned at 7:43, the jungle reappeared in layers of green and shadow. George began glassing immediately. At 8:17, he spotted the 9th sniper, palm tree, 190 yards, low, only 40 feet up, too low, too obvious. The palm fronds created concealment from ground level, but George was elevated. He could see the man's shoulders through the leaves. George did not fire. Something was wrong. The remaining snipers had watched 8 men die. They would not make elementary mistakes. George scanned wider, slower. 11 minutes passed. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan 80 yards northwest, 91 feet up, perfect hide. Vines and branches masked the body from 3 angles. The sniper was not watching George's current position, he was watching George's old one. George understood the trap. The palm tree sniper was bait. If George shot him, the real shooter would track the sound and kill George during the bolt cycle. George flipped the trap. He fired at the decoy. The palm tree sniper fell. Before the echo died, George swung the rifle to the banyan. The real sniper turned toward the sound. Movement betrayed him. George fired before the man could settle the rifle. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Japanese machine guns opened fire seconds later, shredding the rocks George had occupied. He was already moving, east, down, into a drainage ditch. Mud swallowed him to the chest. He held the rifle vertical to keep water from the barrel and waited. 10 confirmed kills. 1 left. The last sniper changed tactics. At 9:47, George caught movement low, not in the trees, on the ground, 60 yards south, crawling, using vines and undergrowth for cover. The sniper was hunting George directly, working along his likely escape routes. George stayed still. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and took position, facing east. Wrong direction, back exposed, easy shot. George did not fire. It was bait again. George widened his scan. At 10:06, he found the second man. 70 yards northwest behind a fallen tree, rifle trained on the drainage ditch, covering fire. The final pair. George could not win a straight exchange. Bolt action meant time. Time meant death. He sank deeper into the water and waited. At 10:13, the man at the rocks stood, signaled, and both Japanese soldiers began sweeping east. They passed George's position, their backs turned. George rose. First shot dropped the nearer man, bolt. Second shot caught the partner mid-turn, 11. The grove was silent for less than a minute. Then voices, infantry. George submerged again as Japanese soldiers moved in to recover the bodies. 6 men at least. They found tracks, they followed them. At 10:31, a soldier appeared at the crater rim and locked eyes with George. George fired from the water. The fight exploded. 3 men fell in seconds. Rifle fire tore through the jungle. George broke contact, ran, dropped, fired again. He moved until the voices faded and the jungle swallowed the sound. At 11:13, George crossed into American lines. 11 snipers dead in 4 days. 14 American deaths avenged. The mail-order rifle had done what doctrine could not, and the jungle finally was quiet. The battalion did not cheer when John George walked back through the perimeter. There was no celebration, no shouting. Just a silence that felt different from the jungles, the kind that comes after something dangerous finally ends. Captain Morris. Listen to the report without interrupting. 11 confirmed sniper kills, 4 days. 12 rounds fired at snipers, 11 hits. Then contact with infantry, close range, breakaway under fire, 2 rounds left in the rifle when George reached the line. When George finished, Morris said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked a question no one had expected. How many men could you train to do this? The question mattered more than the kills. For weeks, the 132nd Infantry had been bleeding from enemies they could not see. Artillery did nothing. Patrols died anyway. Doctrine said massed fire solved problems. The jungle proved otherwise. 1 man with patience and a precise rifle had done what an entire battalion could not. By the next morning, the orders were written. George was no longer just a lieutenant with a strange rifle. He was tasked with building something the Army did not officially have yet. A sniper section. 14 scoped Springfield rifles were located, left behind by Marines. Unertl optics, heavy, accurate, awkward in the jungle. George did not care. Rifles could be learned. Discipline could not. He gathered 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. On paper, they were the best shots in the regiment. On the range, that meant nothing. None of them had waited hours for a single movement. None had taken a life from concealment. None had been hunted while hunting. George stripped it down to fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, reading wind through leaves instead of flags, using trees, rocks, mud, anything that stabilized the rifle. He taught them to shoot once and move immediately, to resist the urge to confirm kills with a second shot, to understand that survival was part of marksmanship. He paired them into two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter watched everything the shooter could not. After a kill, they swapped roles. No single point of failure. No hero shooters. Training lasted days, not weeks. There was no time. When the teams went out, the results were immediate. Japanese positions collapsed under pressure they could not identify. Small groups vanished without firefights. Supply routes emptied. American patrols stopped taking random casualties from treetops. Zero losses during sniper operations. The Japanese began withdrawing west faster than planned. The lesson spread quietly. No memos, no manuals, just results. Then George was shot. A rifle round struck his left shoulder during later operations. The bullet passed through muscle, missed bone, missed arteries. Painful. Serious. Not fatal. He was evacuated. The sniper section continued without him. By early February, Japanese evacuation from the island accelerated. Guadalcanal was effectively decided. For George, the war was supposed to slow down. Instead, it widened. While he recovered, orders came from higher headquarters. A request for experienced jungle officers, long-range operations, deep behind enemy lines, classified mission, no guarantees, volunteers only. George did not hesitate. By March of 1943, he was aboard another transport moving west across the Pacific. His rifle packed carefully, the same rifle that had been laughed at, nearly confiscated, and proven beyond argument. The jungle on Guadalcanal had taught one lesson clearly. Modern war still had room for men who could think alone, move quietly, and place a single shot exactly where it mattered. And the next jungle would be worse, much worse. The transport cut through the Pacific under blackout conditions, carrying John George toward a war that demanded everything Guadalcanal had already taught him, and then asked for more. Orders were brief, destination undisclosed, mission undefined beyond one phrase repeated by every officer who spoke to him. Long-range jungle operations. By April of 1943, George stepped onto Indian soil and learned the truth. He was joining a new formation built for penetration warfare, movement without supply lines, and fighting where maps ended. The unit would later be known as Merrill's Marauders, but at the time, it was simply a collection of men expected to walk where armies did not go. Burma was nothing like Guadalcanal. The jungle was steeper, thicker, and crueler. Rain turned trails into rivers. Leeches bled men dry. Malaria felled squads without a shot fired. Visibility collapsed to yards instead of hundreds. Combat was sudden, violent, and close. The sniper's long view existed only in rare moments. George adapted. He lightened his equipment, swapped optics for a lighter scope, cut weight wherever possible. Ounces mattered when you carried everything on your back for weeks. The Winchester Model 70 came with him, but it was no longer the center of his fighting. It was a precision tool reserved for moments that demanded one clean solution. Those moments still came. At river crossings, Japanese officers exposed themselves to direct traffic. At machine gun nests anchoring ambushes. At ridge lines where one man controlled movement for hundreds, George fired rarely. 3 times on the march. 3 shots, 3 kills, each followed by immediate movement. The jungle punished hesitation. By May of 1944, the Marauders reached Myitkyina airfield. The objective was taken. The cost was severe. Disease crippled the unit, casualties mounted. The force that entered Burma in strength emerged shattered. The operation succeeded, but the unit was finished. George survived. His rifle survived, but something had changed. The Burma campaign taught him what Guadalcanal hinted at. The future of war was speed, volume, and standardization. Semi-automatic fire, squads moving together, logistics feeding everything forward. Precision still mattered, but it no longer belonged to individuals acting alone. It would be formalized, systematized, taught. George was evacuated and reassigned stateside. He never fired the Winchester in combat again. At Fort Benning, he trained officers, not in romance, not in heroism, in fundamentals, how terrain lies, how men move under pressure, how accuracy saves lives when discipline fails. He never bragged, never told stories unless asked directly. Guadalcanal remained something he carried, not something he displayed. After the war, George returned to civilian life. Education replaced operations. He studied, taught, advised. Governments replaced battalions. Policy replaced patrols. The rifle stayed locked away. But the lessons did not. In 1947, George wrote them down. Not as memoir, as record. The book was called Shots Fired in Anger. It was technical, precise, unemotional, and quietly influential. Those who understood it recognized what it was, a field manual written in blood and patience. Sniping would eventually become doctrine. Optics would be issued. Training pipelines built. Teams standardized. Everything George improvised under fire would later wear official stamps. The mail-order rifle did not change the war. But it changed how the Army understood one truth, that under the right conditions, with the right man, one deliberate shot could do what hundreds could not, and that truth never went away. Recognition did not arrive with parades or headlines. It arrived quietly in how the Army changed what it did next. The lessons learned from John George on Guadalcanal and in Burma did not stay confined to after-action reports. They moved sideways, passed from officer to officer, whispered across training ranges and field manuals. What began as one man improvising under fire hardened into practice. By mid-1944, American commanders no longer dismissed optics as sporting toys. Scoped rifles appeared in greater numbers. Units began selecting men not just for strength or aggression, but for patience, for the ability to wait, to observe, to fire once and move. The jungle had taught that firepower alone could not see. George watched the shift from a distance. At Fort Benning, he trained officers who would never know the fear of banyan trees at Point Cruz. He taught them how to read terrain, how to understand where an enemy wanted to hide, and why that place was usually wrong. He never dramatized it. He spoke in measurements, angles, distances, in what worked, in what failed. Some of those officers carried the lessons forward, to Europe, to the Philippines, to Okinawa. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army no longer doubted the value of trained marksmen operating with intention rather than volume. George himself did not return to combat. The war moved too fast. The world shifted too quickly. When Germany collapsed and Japan followed, his fighting was already behind him. He left the Army in 1947 with rank, decorations, and no desire to talk about any of it. The Winchester Model 70 went into storage. Cleaned, oiled, forgotten by everyone but him. Civilian life replaced uniforms with classrooms. George studied politics, graduated with honors, went abroad, Africa, Britain. Policy replaced patrols, meetings replaced movement. He became an expert in regions where influence mattered more than rifles, where persuasion replaced precision. But the discipline never left. When George finally put his experiences on paper, he did not write a war story, he wrote a record. The rifle, the ammunition, the distances, the mistakes, the corrections. No enemy demonized, no hero celebrated, just facts. The book would later circulate among people who understood exactly what it was, a manual disguised as a memoir. As decades passed, the Army refined what George had improvised. Dedicated sniper schools, formalized doctrine, issued optics, team-based employment, everything standardized, everything repeatable. The individuality of Guadalcanal became an institution. The irony was quiet. The very rifle once mocked as obsolete had forced the Army to remember a skill it nearly forgot, that wars are not only won by factories and formations, they are also shaped by individuals who see what others miss and wait when others rush. When George died in 2009, he was 90 years old. His rifle was donated to a museum, placed behind glass with a small placard. Most visitors passed it without stopping. It looked like a hunting rifle. Old, ordinary, unremarkable. They did not hear the jungle. They did not see the trees. They did not know that in January of 1943, one man with that rifle ended a killing that an entire battalion could not, and that in doing so, he quietly changed how modern armies fight. Long after the gunfire faded, the jungle kept its silence. Guadalcanal returned to vines and rain. Burma swallowed its trails. The war moved on, then ended, then became something people argued about instead of lived through. What remained were lessons, quiet ones, passed down without ceremony. The rifle behind glass never told its story. It did not explain patience. It did not explain restraint. It did not explain the discipline required to fire once when panic demanded many shots. To most eyes, it looked ordinary, replaceable, outdated. But wars are not changed by objects alone. They are changed by decisions. A decision to ignore ridicule, a decision to trust skill over doctrine, a decision to wait when others rushed, to observe when others fired, to end a threat cleanly instead of loudly. Modern armies would later institutionalize everything learned in that jungle: training pipelines, optics, team-based sniper doctrine, precision woven into standard operations. What began as improvisation became policy, what was once mocked became mandatory, yet something was lost in the process. The understanding that precision is not technology, it is mindset. No scope guarantees patience, no rifle creates discipline, no doctrine replaces judgment. Those things live only in the individual, sharpened by experience and restraint. That is the quiet Falu. T of Guadalcanal. Not a victory parade, not a medal ceremony, but a permanent shift in how war understood the value of one deliberate mind acting with clarity under pressure. Because sometimes, history does not turn on massive offensives or thunderous breakthroughs. Sometimes it turns at 9:17 in the morning, when a branch moves, and someone is disciplined enough to wait.